Hi there, welcome to the latest episode of my international 10-minute moan. And the topic in this 10-minute moan is to uncover more of the information behind today's exclusive of the Daily Telegraph. Great story written by Camilla Turner, which, as you'll see from her own writings, she has been kind enough to point out that her story was based on freedom of information responses I had, which were follow-ups to my original freedom of information request back in January to the Humza Yousaf's overturning a decision made by Scottish ministers on a predetermined and pre-decided donation to UNICEF, which he decided to not only bin UNICEF as the recipients, he decided to give it to UNRWA, and he upped the amount. So I have given Camilla Turner 2 lots of freedom of information responses I've had, and she's wrote 2 great stories. And this is just to give you some further information that Camilla didn't refer to on her piece, and give you and show you the freedom of information details that I came by. So the letter that I received from the freedom of information response, on page 1, just put it on the screen for you just now, it says that I asked for all correspondence from ministers and any advisors concerning the decision to use funds from the IDF, which is International Development Fund, for donations to UNRWA. Response to your request. The answer to the first part of your question, where I asked why did they not use the Humanitarian Emergency Fund, because that's what it's there for. The answer to the first part of your question is that disbursing funds through the Humanitarian Emergency Fund in this instance was not feasible, as there was insufficient capacity amongst panel members to respond in the area. Now, that's interesting, because just to give you a sort of picture, there's 2 funds that they could have used. They could have used the one they'd eventually used, the IDF, International Development Fund, which is £10 million per year, which can be used, and I'll cover some more of the details of where that can be used later on. But there's 4 countries that can be used for, and it generally has to be money used in the countries by Scottish charities. Obviously, Gaza's not listed, and UNRWA are certainly not a Scottish charity. So they shouldn't be able to use the IDF fund. So what they're saying here is there was insufficient capacity meaning number, amongst the panel members to respond in the area, because the Humanitarian Emergency Fund is £1 million, which is set aside for use where, as the names would suggest, there's any emergencies worldwide. And the people in this, panel members, are set up of charities, people that know where money should be spent. So I think it's quite interesting that the Scottish Government are divulging to me that there was not enough panel members willing to give to Gaza or UNRWA. So that left the Scottish Government a problem, because they're already committed to this money, 2 lots, 500,000 in an initial tranche and 250,000 the second tranche, which is the one that alerted my suspicions there was something wrong. So neither of those were eligible to be used through the HEF, which is where that money should have came from. But the panel members and the charities that decide where that money goes, which isn't the Scottish Government, it's an independent body, said, not for this pot. That was the first thing that came up, which was quite weird about the freedom of information response that I got. The second and third things which I found bizarre were also in the opening letter to myself, the covering letter. I do apologise. And it was 2 things I were pointing out. They can sometimes redact information and give exemptions why they're not giving you information, but they have to tell you why. And I was given 2 peculiar reasons why some information was not given to me. Now, section 29(1)A says it relates to development of the Scottish Government's policy on the response to humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And at the bottom of this section explains their candour in doing so would be affected by their assessment of whether the discussions in response to humanitarian crisis in Gaza will be disclosed in the near future, when it may undermine or constrain the government's view on that policy while it is still under discussion and development. Now that's bizarre, because that tells us that the Scottish Government are still discussing and developing how they're going to fund Gaza going forward. I think that's a bit bizarre, that they've already decided, without somebody asking them for money, they're putting things in place to develop this package of money that goes to Gaza, when they've already had £750,000 and enough people are shouting and screaming about that. Now, the second reason for giving, sorry, this is actually third, but the first reason I actually understood. But the second reason that I thought was a bit weird was Section 30C, where they said they can't give me some information because this would constitute substantial prejudice to the effective conduct of public affairs in terms of its exemption, because it would substantially prejudice our ability to respond to the ongoing review of the processes involved in our response to humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Now, this is key, because they are saying there is an ongoing review into how we responded to this thing in Gaza. All right? When Camilla Turner, the journalist from The Telegraph that wrote the story, contacted the Scottish Government for a response, they said that this review will be done in the future. They're contradicting somebody. So have they started it, or have they not started it? Either way, I think it's odd that we should be contradictory here, because what they've written to me quite clearly says that there's an ongoing review of the processes involved in our response to humanitarian crisis in Gaza. That, to me, is a bit weird. But they've told me that there is a review going on right now about this money that was given to Gaza, and I welcome that. Now, before I go into the documents contained, these emails, etc., that I requested about how we eventually gave the money to Gaza through the International Development Fund, which shouldn't be used, it's probably wise to point out at this point, one of the most senior civil servants to deal with this is in his position from September of 2023, just there. He's also, as you can see from here, one of the key witnesses in the Alex Salmond case for the prosecution, when Alex Salmond was unsuccessfully tried for abusing people. Mr. Griffin took an oath and gave evidence which would have suited the SNP government, because it was bad things about Alex Salmond he was given evidence on. Now, when he was given his job in the end of last year, the job wasn't advertised, there was no competition to fill the role, he was simply moved into the role. This in itself hastened a member of the public to do an FOI as to how this came about. And it's a bit bizarre, because it's heavily redacted. And their defence is, well, although that was an uncompetitive move, which slid him from Director General's move from another department into what is now the Scottish External Affairs Director General. And they moved him from education into that position. And what they're claiming is they didn't need to have a competition for it, because they advertised the job that became vacant when he moved. So he was moved into this job. And I'll just show you some of the details from the third party who asked for freedom of information about how this guy got his job. And Robert Malpass in ScotGov sent out this heavily redacted email which says that's good to flag that the SLC will need to approve the managed move of Joe, right? Now, the SLC is basically the cabinet, okay? And then in a further email that's been redacted, but in this other person's FOI, John Paul Marks says, "Hi Nicky, I'm writing to confirm that I've now spoken to Ms Constance, Ms Gilruth and Mr Robertson with regards, whatever that is, and signalled my intent for a DG managed move," that's Director General, "for Joe, copied and therefore recruit via open and fair competition to backfill the DG Education and Justice role." So that's a role that they moved out. So what they're saying is that this has to get approved by the Cabinet, and here is John Paul Marks in the Scottish Government telling everybody else involved, including Joe Griffin, as you can see in the email, that it's all right, I've got this covered, I've spoke to 3 of the Cabinet Ministers. It's all groovy, isn't it? So this is a guy that was given a job that prior to that had given evidence at the Salmond inquiry against Salmond, defence of the Scottish Government, got a job, that people are asking questions. Why? Because it didn't go through proper process, and the people that are liable to make sure this proper process is in place are making sure it happens. We talked to cabinet ministers in March of last year. He was made up 6 months later. It's a bit convenient, isn't it? Now, Joe's mentioned in quite a lot of these emails. I've got 5 or 6 emails to go through with you, which are a bit damning. So the first one tells you, this is from the Directorate of External Affairs, that basically the money for Gaza is what they call, unfunded at this point, but they will be funded, adjusting spending profiles within the portfolio budget consistent with path to balance. Unprofiled Gaza spending, that means money that they're just giving them. Right? That's not like saying, all right, UNICEF are having a water thing just now, raising money for water. That's a profiled spend. Unprofiled means you just give them money to do what they like with it, right? Unprofiled Gaza spending is currently being absorbed within the ID budget, international development budget, and without support from the wider portfolio. Profiled spending with international development budget is likely to be impacted, including programmes in health, education and equalities in our partner countries, Malawi, Zambia and Rwanda. There's also Pakistan. There's 4 countries that can give money to. So what they're saying in this email is, see this money that you're just giving to Gaza, unprofiled, well, it's going to affect all these things that we've already got that are, eligible for the programme. But they didn't care. They went ahead with it anyway and just gave them money out the International Development Fund, because the fund that they should have used, the people that run that fund said, nah, you're not getting it for Gaza, right? So they just said, we'll just use it anyway. We'll just use IDF. Now, here's somebody writing to Joe. This is the guy that was just spoke about. The spending within this AO, now AO is authorising officer, somebody that can say spend that money, is profiled with the ID budget allocation and blah, blah, blah. Miss McKelvey, that was the Deputy First Minister at the time, has noted her advice to her, copied to Mr Robertson's office, that Gaza will be funded by adjusting spending profiles within the portfolio, consistent with its path to balance. Right, now this is from Joe, right, this guy I was telling you about. Thanks, whoever he's redacted it. In haste, I am spinning a few plates today. I'm content to approve aspects 2 and 3 relating to Gaza just now. However, as just discussed with Scott, I would like us to stop referring to an unfunded pressure in respect of the development budget, please. As the path to balance agreed by Mr Robertson makes provisions for all of our budget lines to balance, the reality is that money will be moved around budgets within the portfolio to accommodate our top priorities, as is the case with Gaza funding. I have just made that point to the First Minister's private office to help inform the First Minister's consideration of the proposal that Ms McKelvey has now endorsed. Now, what we're saying there is, you guys stop saying this word unfunded pressure, right? It sounds bad, right? Well, that's exactly what it is. That's when the First Minister says, see them over there, give them some money and we'll worry about it later, which is exactly one of the emails already 6 months ago put out, where he told his private office, we're just going to give money to UNRWA because I'm meeting them tomorrow, okay? So it also says that we'll just basically move money about to suit. So it doesn't matter, where the money's coming from. We'll just move it about to suit. This is Joe that got his job in weird circumstances after he gave evidence in the Salmon inquiry. This email is a bit concerning because it highlights a few of the things that they've done which are weird. We have received an urgent commission from the First Minister to provide funds and supplies for water supplies to a charity or aid organisation, which would then decide how best to distribute within Gaza. Officials have provided ministers with options to support the First Minister's commission, with a recommendation to provide up to £200,000 for the WASH programme to support UNICEF, if considered to be essential by the ministers. We are now seeking urgent AO, which is authorising officer, approval to release a spend of up to £200,000 for humanitarian assistance to Gaza on the WASH. It says here, this proposed funding will be administered through the Scottish Government out with the usual humanitarian emergency fund panel, processes and humanitarian emergency fund. Therefore, this additional funding for water supplies would need to add to existing unfunded pressure of the 500,000 already approved for Gaza crisis to UNRWA on the 13th of October. Officials have considered various options to provide humanitarian supports for civilians in Gaza, including access to wider Scottish Government budgets. But this is not currently available to us. What other Scottish Government budgets do these people try to take money from? The spend of $500,000 funding from Gaza was approved on the basis that the budget to enable that be found within the current portfolio level path to balance plans, and as such this spend is still having to be managed with no budget identified at this time. Therefore, this new additional spend for Gaza crisis for 100 to 200,000 will increase the existing unfunded pressure in the portfolio budget to amount to £600,000 to £700,000. Now this is somebody in the civil service telling the rest of these people in the civil service, we can't do this, this is unfunded pressure. Then Joe Griffin, the guy that got the job, that nobody can understand why, who previous to that had given evidence at the Salmon inquiry that suited the Scottish Government, he is then, don't use talk like that, stop talking about this unfunded pressure. That's exactly what it is. It is just throwing money away without a clue where we're getting it from. Absolutely ridiculous. So there we go. Absolute mental, absolute embarrassing way that this Scottish Government do things, right? We're giving away money that we can't justify where to take it from. We're just giving it. It's unfunded. Nobody knows where it's coming from, but we'll just give it out anyway, and we'll worry about that later. That's what's going on. You can see that clearly from these. The fact that it came out eventually from the pot of money that was, in line to help 4 countries that we help, that's just part of the policy, right? But we'll just no bother giving it to them. That's affected them. So charities that were already due money are just not getting it anymore. And the fact that those who run the Humanitarian Emergency Fund were not willing to support this money going to Gaza is scary in itself, right? But again, what it shows here is Scotland, the Scottish Government, ministers and even civil servants now, riding roughshod across policies and procedures just to do what Humza Yousaf wants. And that, my friends, I find despicable. So I hope this review that he's been investigated in has a successful outcome and this sort of nonsense stops and he's reprimanded in some way. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. If you've not already done so, please consider subscribing. Most importantly of all, unless you're the Scottish Government ministers or the Scottish Government civil servants that are involved in this sort of nonsense, everybody else have a great day. Cheery bye now.